Victoria Webster is here with us live, and we are talking about breaking the binge cycle. Hello, Victoria.
Hello, Jonno.
So for those of you just tuning in, what we're doing is we're going to be doing a three-part, this is the first edition of a three-part series on ending the war with weight. And so Victoria and I are giving a joint presentation, and in the first section, well, I'm going to address it out, so let's share. So we are going to be talking about how to end the war with weight. And the very first thing we're going to talk about is willpower. And I think a lot of you who are watching this, you've probably lost weight and put it back on and lost weight and put it back on and just think that you don't have any willpower. So we're going to be talking about that. In the second edition, we're going to be talking about feelings with food, because I think the biggest thing that people come up against when they quit dieting is, or when they quit dieting, this is about quitting dieting. When people quit food, is they think they'll never be able to experience joy again. And then finally, we'll be touching on self-worth and thinness. Victoria, I don't know, could you just touch briefly on thinness and self-worth? Because that's a biggie. I don't want to underplay how important it is. Yeah,
that is a very big one. So many people are just walking around with this idea that if I look a certain way, I weigh a certain amount, which is sometimes very arb amount that they've chosen, that then they will be successful, that they will be good enough, that they will be liked, that they will be loved. And even saying things like, if I'm thin, I'm going to be good at my job. You know, the two things are not really connected at all. So it's a huge thing. We base so much on our weight, and it obviously causes a lot of people a lot of distress.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to tee us up. In this edition, we are going to be talking about the willpower thing. So I'm just painting the picture from a diet perspective, and then I'll hand the torch over to you, and we'll have some banter. But basically, what got a real meal to this point really was the old experiment. And most of us know about the dietary guidelines that came out in I think it's 78, and we were told to eat the food pyramid, and obviously that made us fat. But and so what happened is the people started dieting. I mean, people started dieting like 140 years ago. But even when these dietary guidelines came out in 78, and in fact for a few years before as well, this yo-yo dieting trend had continued. And I've seen there's a slide later on in one of the later episodes of this series where you'll see some of the ends that people went to lose weight, like tapeworms and pills and all sorts of stuff. But so what happens is people go through a period of restrictive dieting, and also they put on weight, and then they restrict and they lose weight, and then they put on weight again, and then they lose it. And I've actually seen the studies that show this data where they say like going on a diet actually has a correlation, which obviously doesn't prove causation, but has a correlation with increased weight over an extended period of time. So people who go on diets are more likely to put on weight, according to the data, which is crazy. And so this is my fact slam. The fact slam is that there are like 2 billion obese people in the world, and the diet industry is almost $200 billion. And only 81% of people who lose weight effectively actually put it back on over 5 years after their diet. So we have like a huge failure. We've released dietary guidelines. We have more diets available to people than there have ever been in the history of the world. And only 1 in 5 people manages to keep the weight off for 5 years after they reach their goal weight. And so I've been running this company for 7 years, and I thought that we had the best diet in the world. And that was because everyone lost all their weight. And now most of the people who, I mean, this sounds terrible, but most of the people who, maybe it's a better way to say it, we have a community of long-lasting customers who we've supported. You know, they fall off the bus and they come back. And as cool as it is to have people who love us, like it's kind of heartbreaking that a lot of the people who come back have lost their weight and then put it back on again. So I wanted to change that, and then I met Victoria, and Victoria introduced me to this concept. So over to you, Victoria. Can you explain like what exactly is happening here?
Yeah, so this is basically I would call it the binge cycle. And basically what it's saying is that when you go on a binge, or when you feel out of control with your eating, or you feel very helpless with your eating, there is other stuff going on underneath. And that's incredibly important to recognize. And it's stuff that we are not made aware of because, of course, like we're taught that we should just eat less and, we'll lose weight. So there's actually this whole cycle that happens where our bodies and our minds are responding in a certain way to protect us, essentially, leading us to binge. So basically it starts off with restriction, which is like typical, like your food pyramid. You're going to eat all that crappy, low-fat food, and you're going to feel really hungry, and you're actually going to be starving. And you're going to feel good about losing weight for a little bit. There's going to be a little bit of relief because I'm in control. I'm doing something about it. But then your cravings are going to kick in. And these are both physical, your body's screaming and saying, like, give me food, I'm hungry. And emotional, because maybe you've used food to soothe emotions in the past. So you have this like double whammy of stuff going on. Plus the sugar and stuff that you put into your body is confusing everything. And then this becomes a major trigger, or there's some kind of trigger that happens. And so you find yourself going to the fridge, going out to the petrol station, whatever it is, going to find the food that is going to make that all go away for a second. And then, of course, that leads to guilt and shame, which only adds to then, well, something's wrong with me. I clearly have no willpower. I'm just weak. And then to try and soothe that feeling, which is actually not very accurate, there's an attempt to restrict. And so the cycle goes on and on and on. And so it's actually terrible. It's actually so distressing.
Yeah, I've even had clients who said to me that, like, Jonno, I had a massive weekend. I want to do like a 4-day broth fast. And I'm like, well, I mean, that'll certainly work. Like, you'll be back to where you started. But I'm yet to meet the person who did the 4-day broth fast, lost the weight, and then carried on like nothing had happened. Usually there's it yo-yos back, or at least it seesaws back. So like after the broth fast, it's very unlikely that you'll keep it together afterwards. So
definitely.
It hurts. Okay.
Because that's also a little bit of a problem in thought process. It's the idea that now I've eaten too much, now I must starve myself. It's that whole diet culture type of thinking. So that's what we're trying to move away from when we're looking at that binge cycle, is getting stuck in that thought process.
So then what you're saying is actually that the binge cycle is connected to the sort of yo-yo dieting outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. I think it basically, it's what makes you yo-yo. So you put on weight, restrict. Sometimes this can last for a day, a week, 2 weeks, but then you can't keep it up and your body is literally starving. So you do your whole binge cycle and you put on weight, you try again, which is hard, and you lose motivation. You restrict, etc. And so it just goes up and down.
I mean, I've seen it happen to people who lasted like a year and they lost 35 kilos. And then after losing 35 kilos of just white knuckling it, but not doing a hell of a lot of internal work and just coming out at the end and then thinking like, oh, well, that's not a problem anymore. And just all of a sudden, it just, you go on like a 3-month binge. I've heard people lose like a year's worth of weight that they lost and put it back on in like 2 months, basically.
Yeah. And that white knuckling is, again, another major issue. It's like hanging on for dear life. There's no support. There's no help with all the different things you experience in this process. You're kind of doing it alone, along with thinking there's something wrong with you. And so eventually a person just runs out of steam. There's only so much that a person can do.
Yeah. So talk to me about this slide. We've got the 80-20 rule that no one's talking about.
Yeah, people don't talk about it, which is crazy. So this is basically all the different reasons that we would get into the cycle and stay in the cycle. And the idea here is that guilt and shame is obviously a very important one. And these are feelings, the same as anxiety It's an emotion, it's a feeling. Then there's emotional cravings, so wanting to soothe feelings with food. And then triggers, well, okay, let me talk about the physical cravings. That's obviously to do with the body and biology and everything. And then there are triggers, which are often emotional. And so the idea is that 80% of what we're dealing with is around feelings. It's not even so much to do with the food. The 20% is to do with what you put into your body, but the other 80% is all the other stuff. So, and no diets, no programs address the other stuff.
Yeah.
Which is why they all fail in the end.
Yeah. I mean, it blows my mind. So they address what they're handling 20% of the problem with 100% of the, 100% of the solution only deals with 20% of the actual problem, which is mind blowing.
Exactly.
It said every dietitian, here's a picture of the food pyramid. Make sure you have 5 small meals a day.
That gives me stress. That makes me anxious because I've had that experience, and you just think, I need help. I need something different. I need support in this. Don't just give me the same thing that never works. But yet we try. We hope. Yeah. We really hope something's going to change, but it never does. Yeah.
Yeah. So what's happening with the brain and the tummy here?
So this is really what our bodies are trying to do. They're actually trying to take care of us. But because they have been in these cycles of dieting, soothing emotions, soothing bodily sensations, using food, us always turning to food with our bodies, that's what our bodies are used to. And so when you're restricting, our body suddenly says, oh no, they're restricting, I need to do something. And so often a binge is a result of your body trying to protect you. And I know that sounds a bit like counterintuitive that can be the case, but it's actually a response to stress happening in the body. And then similarly, it's like if we're not feeling good, our brains are going to kick in and say, well, we need to do something to make this feel better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what psychology drives behavior, memories, thoughts, feelings, emotions. What's happening here?
So it's kind of like the iceberg theory. So how we feel, how we think, how we behave on the surface, the stuff we're aware of, is driven by our beliefs about the world, how we deal with our emotions, and a lot to do with our experiences growing up and how that forms how we interact with the world. So actually, there's so much going on underneath that drives what happens on the surface. So an example is if I have a binge and just like lose the plot with eating, often there is some reason, there's some emotional response going on that I might not even be aware of that's actually playing out. And my instant automatic go-to when I'm vaguely feeling anxiety is eat. I don't even have time to recognize that that's what's going on underneath. But before I know it, I'm at the fridge. And again, it can feel like you have no control. It can feel like, why am I just doing these things without being able to manage them? And it's because there's a process that's driving it underneath.
Yeah. I must say I get that with my clients a lot. Like they'll say stuff like, oh my God, like I've completely fallen off the bus. My eating's totally out of control. We need to talk about it. And that's in like the text before our session. And it's like when they say we need to talk about it, what they're hoping I'll give them is like a stern talking to, like pull yourself together or whatever. And it's never that. Obviously, you ask some questions and they're like, well, I didn't get paid my salary. I'm having like a war with my housemate who's like, in and out of rehab, and I have and I haven't been home in like 6 weeks. They're like, can we talk about my eating? I'm like, dude, like, let's talk about your feelings, like what's going on.
And we don't connect the two. It's this idea of, it's called the mind-body connection. It's just that we sort of think that how we think is just separate to our body. They're two separate sort of entities. Yeah. So it's connecting those two.
And so it can feel like hunger, but actually...
Yeah, it can. Yeah.
So then there's a new model, right? So we spoke about this thing, this model, and it looks like a difficult problem to solve. So what are the things that we can do to actually stop this cycle in its tracks?
So there actually are a lot of things you can do, even though it feels difficult and it feels overwhelming, and it does take practice. That's the other thing. When you're trying to change behaviors, you've got to practice them. So the first thing is, there's obviously a lot of anxiety that goes on around restricting, binging, the whole thing, eating. Actually, just eating can be incredibly stressful for some people because their relationship with food this whole time has been really damaging. So the very first thing is some coping mechanisms to deal with anxiety, just to be able to kind of get through some of those really tough moments. And there's a lot of different techniques to distract yourself, to call people for help, write things down. There's a whole bunch of things that you can do to diffuse anxiety. And that also, very importantly, this is where support comes in, and having people you can talk to is really, really important. So that's the first thing. And then once we're able to sort of move through the anxiety, it's about starting to be really aware of what's going on. So aware of what is actually the emotion that's driving me to have cravings.
Yeah.
And that takes, I mean, I think one of the biggest things that helps with that is mindfulness. And I'm not talking about like meditating on the beach, you know, being all zen and silent for half an hour. I just mean taking time, whether you're doing it in the activities you're doing during the day or when you're eating, just to be really aware of your thoughts and your feelings, to not judge them, because that shuts down thinking, but just to say, all right, actually, I'm feeling really anxious in this moment, or this thing at work is still sitting with me and I'm carrying it with me still from earlier in the day, or whatever the case was. So allowing yourself to be aware.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. This mimics the alcohol cycle quite a lot. I remember like identifying. So during lockdown, obviously things went pear, and I haven't like had a drink in years. And I remember like there was one day in lockdown where I thought, Flip, I really want a beer right now. And I was so perplexed because like, why on earth would I want a beer? And then I remembered like throughout the day, and I chatted to my wife, and then I was like, oh, I'm lonely. Like, you know, I haven't seen another person in like 5 weeks.
Yeah.
And then, but just knowing that that's what it was, I was like, oh, I don't need a beer. I'm just lonely. So that makes sense.
Yeah. And that's quite empowering as well, because you can say, okay, this is actually what's going on. Not just ignore it.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Okay, removing and processing triggers. Well, can you just like maybe unpack what a trigger is in a bit more detail?
So a trigger is some kind of event or something that happens where suddenly you are acting from your old belief system. So say, for example, conflict is a huge issue for you. You've grown up not being able to deal with it. Maybe it was a difficult thing for your family, whatever the case was. So when you are faced with conflict, you shut down automatically. So conflict would be a trigger, even if it's in a situation that is not actually dangerous or actually too difficult. Suddenly that shutdown will just happen because it's a trigger, and you will react in a way that's dysfunctional to that situation. So you can see why triggers can be quite dysfunctional and damaging, because suddenly you just hit with a whole bunch of emotions that make you reacting in a healthy way, really difficult.
So like when you walk down the street and smell Cinnabon baking their cinnamon rolls, is that also a trigger?
That could be a trigger.
So there are pedestrian kind of menial. I mean, it's not to diminish the magnitude of that trigger for some people, but like there's some deep level triggers, and then there's just some normal like I saw the brownie on the table and it was steaming, and I thought, wow, that looks delicious, and so that's also a trigger, right? Okay.
Yes. But then I would argue that you could even say the brownie's on the table and it's steaming. What does that relate to? That relates to some kind of comfort around food that you had as a kid, you could go deeper, but yes, they're less deep ones as well.
Okay. So how do we remove, or what does processing a trigger mean?
So again, it's about awareness. It's not necessarily about not having the trigger. That can happen later on, where you don't even think about it. But the beginning part is recognizing it, knowing it's happening, and just making sure you don't act in accordance with that trigger. So back to the conflict example, there would be some kind of conflict that would happen, and instead of running away from it, you would say something, or you would engage in it and see what the outcome would be. Okay. So it's acting differently towards your triggers.
Okay. And so what I see we've done here is we've gone from like the restrict stage. And so like once this, we haven't done anything with restrict or binge yet, but if you've diffused anxiety, you've identified your cravings and connected with them, really is what you're saying. And you've managed to find a way to process triggers, then in theory, you may not binge. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. But in the event that you did binge and you were dealing with all the shame, what is redefining shame? I mean, how bad is shame?
Yeah, shame is a damaging kind of emotion, but especially when it's dealt with just in your own head, just internally. And it's so damaging because shame is all about, I am bad. There's something wrong with me. I am a mistake. Instead of saying I've made a mistake. So if someone's dealing with that on their own, it can get to a really, really, damaging place in their head. And so redefining shame, the best way to do that is you need some kind of external, like reflection. You need people to help you to unpack the shame. So talking about binging, someone might point out to you, well, you did have a really hard day, not as an excuse, but we can understand that you were really anxious, you were really upset, and this was part of leading to the binge, instead of just, well, I'm just a really bad person who's weak. You can start to figure out some of the external factors that are part of the problem. So that's incredibly important. And I think with shame, it needs to involve other people. It needs to involve connecting with other people. Yeah.
Yeah. What is your quote you always say about shame? Shame grows in our
silence. Shame grows in our silence. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. So, and does that mean like if you talk about stuff you're ashamed of, the shame just goes away?
Yeah, I mean, it might not disappear like straight away, but definitely the power it holds over you is gone, because it only holds the power because it's in our own heads and we're talking to ourselves that way. Right. But the minute it's out there, it doesn't have the power anymore. And I really see it all the time with the eating psychology course, but also in addiction work where I'm running groups. Yeah. Just one person sharing a shameful story and other people listening, other people might even relate in some way. You can see the weight lifted off of that person. So in some ways, it is quite an instantaneous process.
Yeah, I've seen that with a few of the people in the Eat Psych program as well.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
In fact, speaking of so for those of you who didn't hear me in the beginning, we're talking about the Eating Psychology Transformation Program. And this is a message from Jess Barker about it. She is digging it. She says, I feel like I've had a total life revelation. For the first time in years, I've been able to move out of my life paralysis and start making enjoyable, healthy choices for myself that extend far beyond the food I put into my mouth. I've always tried to treat the symptom, weight gain, and have never looked at the cause. This is exactly what we were talking about. This will take you back to square one so that you can understand why you do what you do and then nurture you through making different decisions. The result is not only weight loss, but a totally holistic and sustainable life improvement. So that's Jess. She is great, hey? And she's from Sedgefield in South Africa. I don't know why it said Sedgefield, Cape Town. That's my bad. If you've ever had a newsletter from me, you know that I'm terrible at spelling, so I apologize. So, I mean, I wanted to just take you through that concept. Not you, Victoria. I know you know that this is a thing, but can you imagine rocking up at a buffet at a party and having no anxiety around that plate? So not thinking about what other people are watching you put on your plate, not thinking of this as an opportunity to really like let loose, but also not thinking, not feeling anxious about like whether or not you should put 2 or 6 olives on the plate. So just going up there and treating this experience as like a normal meal that you will just enjoy, that will nourish you, and then carrying on with your day. And so if you're watching this, I want you to think about what it would feel like to actually have that experience, because that's what we're doing with the eating psychology program. And so in this one, we've addressed the willpower. You're not broken. There's nothing wrong with your resolve, but you've been dealing with it the wrong way. You've been dealing with only 20% of the problem with all the diets you've been doing. And as Victoria explained, there's another 80% that we never deal with. And so in the next workshop, we'll be talking about enjoying life without food, or what life can bring you without food. I don't think that's the right word. I think that the what I'm trying to say is like the expression people won't enjoy. People think that if they have to change the way they eat, that they won't be able to experience joy, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And you're gonna obliterate that myth for us.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks for watching, guys. Stay tuned for the next one. And bye.